Welcome to this week's episode of the Caregivers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Ropeleski, and you can call me Dr. Mark. Caregiving has always demanded a lot from people. It asks for patience. It asks for judgment. It asks for emotional steadiness in moments that can feel uncertain, exhausting, and deeply personal. But now there's something else in the room with us all the time. The phone, the feed, the news, the endless scroll of fear, outrage, uncertainty, conflict, and noise. And for many people, it's no longer just background. It's shaping mood, shaping thought, shaping family relationships, shaping what we believe is true, and shaping how much of ourselves is still available to the people who need us and who rely on our care. So today, we are asking a bigger question. What does it mean to try to care well in a media environment designed to keep us distracted, divided, and emotionally activated? Our guest today is media psychologist Dr. Pamela Rutledge. And this conversation is about what that environment is doing to us. Why is it so hard to resist? And how we can stay informed without losing our clarity, our relationships, or ourselves. The easiest way to support the show is to subscribe wherever you listen on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. It's totally free and it helps us tremendously. Plus, it means you never miss an episode. We appreciate you listening. Dr. Pamela Rutledge, welcome to the Caregivers Podcast. We're so happy you're here, and we're really looking forward to an amazing discussion today.
Thank you so much for having me.
It always breeds a certain excitement at the beginning as we're about to delve into an amazing conversation, and there's nothing I ever want to do more than jumping right in. So, Pamela, tell me, what happens to us psychologically when we live in a media environment designed to keep us interrupted, hooked, and just engaged all the time?
I think a lot of things go on, but one is that our brains are wired to be interruptible, right? That was how we survived. We paid attention to things that moved. We paid attention to things that were dangerous. So anything that interrupts us, we have to pay attention to instinctively. So it takes a lot of intention to recognize that we're no longer on the savannah with saber-toothed tigers, that we're in a modern environment that our brains weren't quite created for. So it's a question of maintaining your awareness of your behavior, which is, of course, really hard, but it's really essential in this media environment to be aware of what you're doing and how the media engages you. It isn't just you engaging it. It's an active participant in that relationship.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to explore that a little bit further. There's a difference between hearing a rustle in the leaves, wondering if there's a predator there, to now hearing pings and notifications and hearing about likes and comments. And I mean, this is next level. How do we understand that conceptually, psychologically?
Okay, well, the first thing I think people need to realize is that not all engagement with media is bad, right? That there's positive uses and negative uses. But what those pings and all of those things are telling us is that it's a social engagement, right? Those pings are because a person liked us or because there's something related to people. And it's very hard for us to resist social engagement. That's one of the primary needs of a human being, right? Is to be connected with others. We saw that through all of the research on attachment theory by Bowlby and all of these people who, throughout the sort of history of psychological research and have shown how important feeling connected to other people is in terms of our general and physical well-being, not just our mental health, but how we thrive physically. So recognizing that these are proxies, as it were, or little symbols of people, can help us understand why we're so reactive so that we can take steps to make judgments about how much we want to engage.
For someone who's already carrying the emotional load of caregiving, what does it do to the nervous system to spend hours each day cycling through what may also be fear, outrage, conflict, urgency, and just short-form stimulation constantly?
Right. Well, people like to call that doom scrolling, right? Where you're scrolling continuously and you can't set it down and you're looking at negative news. But I want people to understand also that sometimes just scrolling through social media leaves you feeling unhappy or upset or distressed, right? Through social comparison or whatever. So recognizing that what matters is how it makes you feel, not the content per se, right? But so when we're in an environment where we're getting all this negative information, where people are angry, where they're outraged, where with things that are making us afraid, and right now everything's very frightening out there in the world, it amplifies our own sense of fear and our sense of vigilance. Now, for caregivers, that's like a double whammy, right? Because you're already talking about people who are in a position where they have to pay attention to the needs of someone else. They're actually trying to forecast what's going to happen in the future because that's how they provide the best care. What's someone going to need? Have they taken their medicine? How do I need to, help with this thing or that thing? So it's like taking somebody who's already on hypervigilance and ramping it up so that they are in almost, the brain at a certain point is just going to say, I'm checked out, right? Where your brain just goes numb, which means you're not only not doing the job that you want to do, but you're distancing yourself from the relationships around you that provide you with support.
I mean, some of it I could even see going one step further as, there's more and more awareness that caregivers need to find space to take care of themselves, that you get that next level angst that comes from the fact that you're realizing I have not that much time for myself. And all of these reels are telling me I need to be doing all these things to be successful and meet the tick boxes. And that just sort of leads to next level cortisol surges and almost compounding just the to-do list of caregiving.
Well, I think it compounds everyone's, but I think caregivers are really, really in the target there. And what we should, there's all kinds of interesting research that, started with the stress research, right? About how once you're sort of amped up, it's very hard to go back down, right? Our neurotransmitters or our neurons are sort of hypersensitive to stress and anxiety. And we don't just instantly go back to normal. So you've got all these people now that are hypersensitive to threat, right? And that could be negative news. It could be somebody, outraged about, something going on politically or socially. It could be somebody in your family. I mean, it doesn't have to be on media, but you are now overreactive, right? Which means you've got cortisol running. So it's not only bad for your relationships, it's bad for your health. Right? In other words, it makes it harder to do all those things that we want to do, like get a good night's sleep.
Get some exercise and some quiet thinking in without thinking about the whole world, when you just have a moment to maybe think about nothing and be in the moment. Does dopamine at one point no longer factor in? Is it all just cortisol driven? So we always think about how we turn towards some of the, the effects of the reward of dopamine. But when you're already in such a stress state, does dopamine not even factor into it anymore? And is it just all the stress hormones that take over?
Well, I think it obviously depends on what someone's doing, and as you all well know, these neurotransmitters aren't discrete. It isn't like you get this one and
it's not black and
this
white.
one.
Yeah, it's all relative.
It's a very
relative
complex relationship. So if you get a ping that you think is coming from one of your social media accounts, then you might get a little dopamine, sense of reward, because you think that's, someone reaching out to you. We all respond that way. That's not an abnormal response. But when you then go on and now you're seeing negative things instead of positive things, or you're seeing somebody having this fabulous vacation, someplace where you'd really like to go, and so you're feeling left out, you're feeling all these things, then you're bringing that back into the world with you, right? You've sort of created that cortisol thing. And to make matters worse, you're now back in the real world. You just wasted 20 minutes watching somebody else's vacation that sort of annoyed you. And now you didn't do your job like you like to do it. So you not only have the stress of whatever happened, but you have the self-recrimination, because most people who are caregivers are very giving and empathic people, right? They want to do a good job. And one of the challenges, I think, of caregiving is that a lot of it is hard to find the reward unless you're really looking for it. In other words, sometimes progress is the absence of decline, Or sometimes progress is making someone's life better, even under the worst of circumstances. And sometimes it's incredibly rewarding. It's just someone who needs help. But I think we have to recognize that that caregivers in general are people very empathic and very sort of internally responsible, wanting to do a good job in an almost impossible situation. So, one of the things that I like to think about is how can we take all those thoughts that we're having, and, they're not alone in having, self-recrimination. I mean, I can self-recriminate with the best of them, but how do we recognize when we've got that internal voice going so we can do something about it?
And convert some of that negative energy to maybe a little bit of self-compassion as a caregiver, or grace in the moment, and presence in the moment. So has short-form media really reshaped our attention spans? And if so, what is it actually doing to our ability to reflect, self-regulate, and think critically?
Well, there's the research is pretty conflicting on that, and right now we're sort of in a massive moral panic about social media in general and how it's destroying Western civilization. But we've actually been through that moral panic with video games and the radio and books and all back through history. But I think that we just need to realize, first of all, that this is a unique period in time, that there's a huge amount of information available to us. And I think of it a little bit like going to a buffet. Right? If you go to a restaurant and you have a few things to order from the menu, and then you order the turkey leg, and then you get the turkey leg, right? But if you go to a buffet, there's all of these choices that you have. You can taste them all. So your instinct is to say, okay, I need to taste all these things and figure out which ones I really like, because there's an opportunity cost in picking the wrong thing. Right? In a much different way than if you don't have many choices. So what we're faced with is this buffet of information. So the initial response for anyone is to run all around and see what's out there and try all these things. Most people, after experimentation, will then start to curate their behavior and their engagement to the ones that matter to them. Those aren't always the most positive ones, but people do tend to narrow down their engagement. I'm not sure that you could call that influencing attention. I don't think that it's fair to judge the most effective way to navigate this environment by old standards. I think it's really important to recognize that what we learned before social media is important, but this is a completely different environment, and we have to figure out what's effective and adaptive in this environment, not just what is different from before. So I haven't seen evidence that attention spans are diminishing as much as that people are trying to manage too much information.
Well, it's that notion of the buffet, right? Is that if you haven't tried everything, or you haven't gone back multiple times, you may not be getting the value out of the experience. And with so many options out there on social media and so many feeds, you could see where that sort of thinking might parallel. But what about self-regulation and actually being able to think critically when you're getting, so many quick hits coming in? It seems like that capability might be eroded by the current social media schema.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question whether it's been eroded or whether we're in an environment that shows the weak links in our abilities. In other words, this is about the time I haul out my soapbox and say, how come we've got this incredibly powerful tool and we haven't been teaching people how to use it? We aren't investing in teaching people how their brain works or the vulnerabilities so that they recognize these things in the same way that we would recognize other behaviors that we want to control. So that kind of awareness is something that we haven't invested a lot in. So I don't know that if it's whether or not we have lost the ability to self-regulate or whether it's a muscle that we haven't strengthened to the degree that we need it right now. There's certainly lots of instances where people have trouble self-regulating and there's no media involved at all.
Absolutely.
So it's not exactly, something where we're like, oh, what a surprise, you can't self-regulate. It's a genuine issue in terms of balancing our near-term goals with sort of our longer-term goals, or our near-term desires with our longer-term goals. What the media does do, however, is it makes it very difficult, I think, to get to intentionally step past these near-term desires. In other words, they're all just right in your face, in front of you all the time. And so you actually have to be very thoughtful and think about, what is it that I'm trying to do here in my life, or in this day, or in this week, or in this job? And is this behavior going to get me there? And that's the one skill that I think we're really lacking, is identifying goals and how our behaviors, even on a daily basis, are fitting into those kinds of things.
Well, I'm glad you're here to teach us and to follow up on what you just said. And we certainly have lots of caregivers listening. And if ever there's a population that could benefit from that learning, I think it's caregivers. So on that same point, then, why do people keep going back to platforms that may even sometimes leave them feeling worse after they've engaged with them and after they've deleted the apps from their phones, and then they swear they're done, but there they are back again?
Well, I think any behavior, I firmly believe, has a payoff, right? In other words, we're doing something because we're getting some kind of benefit out of it. Now, it's a positive benefit. It may not be positive in our, the life scheme, but there's some kind of payoff. So if someone can't stand to be away from some app or some group, then you have to say, what was that group providing? Was that group providing a sense of belonging? Was that, if I'm, and I know there are different kinds of caregivers. There's some people who choose this intentionally, and this is, their life's work. And there's some people who have, for one reason or another, been put into the position where they are a caregiver, and it might not have been their first choice, or they're doing it to support the family, or they're doing it for some other reason. So there's all kinds of opportunities for resentment to build. And especially for people who have a kind of caregiver personality, it's very easy to have an other focus and sort of wonder why no one's thanking you, right? In other words, you're doing all this stuff silently, you're managing all this emotional load, you're doing all of this internal work that's not visible to anyone. And a common thing for people like that is to not know how to ask for help, and to be sort of waiting for people to thank them, right? I mean, it's kind of like raising teenagers, right? If you're waiting for your teenager to thank you, you gotta wait.
Yes.
Right? But it doesn't mean you're not frustrated in the near term. And so sometimes these groups are an outlet for anger or frustration, where people validate those feelings. Now, it doesn't necessarily make the feelings better. Sometimes it makes them worse. It's kind of like, God damn it, why don't you see me? And where, they could be getting that kind of connection through a more positive way. But if someone keeps going back to something that ultimately doesn't make them feel good, then it's really important to step back and say, what is it that's so compelling? What am I trying to do? And if I really need support, maybe I should find a group that's positively supporting, not just going to make me more angry. Now, granted, that takes a certain amount of self-reflection. And so what I hope is that the caregivers are able to find groups that allow them to talk about these things in a positive way, right? Not everyone can afford a therapist or has the time to, go to, see a counselor or a life coach. But there are all kinds of groups of people, sort of dealing and struggling along with these difficult questions, where they can help you focus on the sort of meaning and purpose of the occupation, even if that means we all know it's not always fun, but it's okay for something to be not fun and still have meaning and still have purpose, and that you recognize that there's this duality. It isn't all or nothing. And I think that's a really important thing to think about when you're frustrated, is that frustration is normal. but it doesn't negate the value of what you're doing. I think I kind of went off road there, but...
Well, no, not at all. And certainly, I think a crisis of meaning is something that's really at the forefront of a lot of discussions these days, and it's been popularized by Arthur Brooks' recent work, and that whole notion that social media may actually not allow that part of the brain that can seek meaning and develop a sense of meaning to function as it's being consumed by by a lot of short feeds and quick moments. But I'd like to change gears a little bit, because behind all of this is an engine, and the engine's not designed accidentally. The media business the model depends on attention capture and emotional activation and identity reinforcement in certain circumstances. But if the business model is to keep us engaged at all costs, are fear, outrage, and conflict and online fighting part of the product, or do they actually make us the product that's desired?
Well, first of all, we are the product. So anybody out there who thinks social media is free, it's not, right? Your attention, your data is how you are paying for that service, right? So you're making a trade-off. And, it may be that the problem with these business models is that it should be a business model that charges us actual money and keeps our data, or, gives us that kind of choice. But the idea that this is free means people are a little bit not paying attention or unaware of what they're really paying in terms of attention, in terms of giving someone attention, because on the other side of that, somebody's making money off of that.
There's more to, yeah. Go ahead,
so
sorry.
What do we pay attention to? Things that are emotional, right? That's the biggest sticky goo of the internet, is anything that heightens our emotion. And you see this a lot with the structure is built like that, but you see this a lot with influencers, right? They'll do something that's a little crazy, and then they have to do something a little bit crazier and a little bit crazier, because they keep trying to get attention, because it's the eyeballs on their account that are allowing them to make money or allowing them to get brand subsidies. So there's all these levels of monetization that somebody's benefiting from, but you're not getting a dime in the mail. So just be aware that you're supporting this income stream with where you look and how much you spend your time online.
But there's also higher costs involved that maybe we don't consider. But when every issue has to be reduced to a 3-second hook to win attention of the viewer, what gets lost in how people actually understand complex realities or actually formulate their opinions if you're relying on 3 seconds?
Well, I think people don't formulate very much. I think it's a problem of all of that information, that people are not able to synthesize that amount of information. So the solution to that for most people is they curate based upon what feels right. So if I'm making judgments about who I want to listen to, I'll pick somebody who agrees with me, because that feels much better. So it's a very different information flow than when there were limited media channels, and there was like ABC, NBC, and Walter Cronkite, and that was sort of your menu, to now where you have infinite choice, which means that you aren't exposed to as broad a range of ideas unless you make the effort, which means you're not at doing what you're talking about, which is thinking through things. Oh, that doesn't agree with that. Well, I wonder why that is. What else is out there that will help me understand this disparity between these two people? All of this conflict has caused people to sort of go down to little sort of, information bubbles, right? Little silos,
right,
that reinforce their beliefs, and it's being socially promoted, these kinds of tribes. In other words, it's how you show your allegiance now politically. It isn't based on facts. It's like what you sort of subscribe to is an indicator of what group you're in. Right. So it's almost become antithetical to thinking is how you interpret and distribute information. So the problem isn't just the media, the problem is that we have a social structure right now that is taking advantage of that discrepancy between information and fact.
Absolutely. And the flip side is that if you hear something that you disagree with or doesn't fit with your schema, you're going to shred that. You're not going to think about alternatives, or you're not going to listen. And we're 30 episodes in, and it's amazing how one clip can decide what a 90-minute discussion is all about, in the opinion of some. And it's been fascinating as a host to witness some of that. So when news has to compete then in an attention economy that rewards outrage, fear, division, all of these things, does it actually stop informing people, but just merely keeping them angry and afraid and just addicted to the cycle?
Yes. That was a short answer. Yes, and it goes back to the question of intention, right? And it's sort of like, on TV, you have choices, right? You have, and you have to make those choices. But with social media, somehow we are not transferring that model of choice. Some people will say to me, "Oh, this person on Facebook or Instagram really makes me mad," and blah blah blah. And I'll say, "Well, block them. If you were at a party and someone was annoying and you wouldn't stand next to them, why would you do it on social media?" But we haven't transferred these sort of social skills of boundary setting, which are hard, on the best of times, to an online environment. And so, it makes it very difficult when we aren't exercising intention to combat the people who take advantage of the fact that the human brain is lazy.
So when people say that this feels like programming or propaganda, what is actually being exaggerated in that language, and what's actually true about how repetition and framing and platform design shape beliefs in the end?
Well, when someone says that's propaganda, that means I don't agree with this these days. And, propaganda was really a term that we used to talk about information that came from the other side, right? The enemy, like the first propaganda stuff was World War II, and it was,
Dumped out of planes.
Yeah, well, and trying to combat the story they were telling versus the story that we're telling. And from both sides, the other guy's information was propaganda, and, with good reason, because when it's our side, we tell you the stuff we want you to know that makes us look good, and we don't tell you the stuff that we really, where we kind of stepped in it. So, propaganda has become, whether you call it misinformation or fake news or whatever you want to call it, it's now information that we don't agree with. And because it's become so attached to identity, when there's information that we don't agree with, we tend to write it off rather than investigate whether there's any validity to it. We don't stop and say, well, what would that do? Or what would that policy mean? We just go, oh, the guy's crazy, he's whatever. And, we've resorted to name calling as a form of argument, which is kind of an all-time low, it seems to me. But I suppose during the yellow journalism and all that stuff back in the day, this isn't new news, but we've lost the ability to have conversations about conflicting ideas, which I think is very sad, because we don't learn if we don't have something that challenges our way of thinking.
It's foundational to all relationships. You can see back when those initial times when you were referring to, you had two sides and you had a lot of people on each side. Now it seems like the propaganda machine is viewed from one person to another person's opinion, or to maybe a collective's opinion. But it's all, it's brought down to such a micro interactional scale compared to the original two camps that played off each other, if you will.
Yeah, that's an interesting byproduct. When the internet was first went public, and people were really excited about the idea that it was giving voice to people who didn't have a voice before, right? But now we have an environment where we're sort of, where the loudest voices are making us think that's, common opinion. And it goes back to what you mentioned a minute ago about frequency. Our brains rely on certain patterns to make sense of the world, right? And always have, and this is, maybe we need to have some kind of evolutionary adjustment there, but when we hear something a lot, when it's something that agrees with us, when it's something with a little bit of emotion in it, all of these things increase the likelihood that we'll take something as a fact, a fact of life, whether or not it's an actual fact. So now we're in this position of believing things that are just frequently said rather than researching. And, and which leaves us in the position of claiming the other guy is wrong, because if he's right, then I'm wrong. And then, and now I have some kind of ego attack, right? They're attacking me because I'm wrong. And so it makes it very difficult to come to any discussion.
It just seems like the pace is what's taken over, and that when you need to reflect, you actually need time, and you need to think of a couple of situations or a couple of perspectives. But now when you get micro-bombarded with all of these ideas quickly, and your positioning depends on an immediate reaction quickly, you can see where the whole process just falls apart. There is no time afforded for deliberation and self-reflection to come up with opinion, let alone put your opinion out there and risk it getting annihilated.
That's a great point, because our initial response is, of course, always going to be emotional, because that's the part that triggers first. When social media was first out, my nephew, who was at that point in middle school, he really liked it because he was very shy. And so when somebody would text him, he liked having the time to think about a response. But I think, as you point out, most people are responding instantly based upon their first reaction, which is 90% of the time an emotional one, not a thoughtful, cognitive one.
So we're being activated, but not necessarily informed.
Right.
We're going to take a little break, folks, and be back shortly with our guest, Pam Rutledge.
So, as someone who has been making content and producing content for almost 20 years now, when I started, social media was positioned as something that was going to bring us together. It was something that would, democratize the ability to share our opinions. And there wasn't suddenly the gatekeepers that controlled who got to, sit in front of a camera or microphone disappeared. And it felt good initially to be part of that. And I've just, for myself, even though we're producing a show that's about supporting caregivers and bringing really important topics to people and to audiences, I've started to feel like over the last couple of years that I'm almost working for big tobacco, because I'm aware of how toxic it is in general. So even when you're trying to, as a creator, put something good into the world, I still feel like I'm working within a system that is corrupt and toxic a lot of the time. And so what's your perspective on that? We're almost forced into working for these platforms by creating this content, and we know that it's not good for kids, and this platform is, countries are looking at banning this platform for under 16. What's your sort of thought in participating in this, even when you're trying to do something positive?
Okay. Well, so first of all, a lot of this reaction that you're talking about, we don't know that it's good for kids. That's actually not true. The research doesn't really support that in a kind of broad way. What the research says is, like we were talking about earlier, it can be good or bad depending upon how you're going to use it, right? And so while I agree with you that this system is set up to reward the kind of content that gets people's attention, it isn't the only kind of content that people listen to. Right. So it's one of those things where I would say, don't abandon, the good fight. Right. You don't just say, okay, well, you jerks can have it all. You say this matters, and this is something I put out there. I'm sure that the people who listen to, your podcast aren't looking for the thing that's going to be the most scintillating. They want some real information. They want a sense of connection, knowing that there are other people out there dealing with the same kinds of things that they're dealing with. That's an incredibly valuable emotional validation, right? And so maybe it's only 10,000 people instead of 10 million people. It's in the years that I was doing therapy, which was brief before I went back to studying media because it's a lot more fun. Is that recognizing that if you change someone's trajectory just a little bit, it's like shooting for the moon, right? You aim for the moon and you go that way, you move it a little bit, and you are completely out there someplace, right? So you don't need to make a lot of change for people. You need to shift their thinking just a little bit to have that make logarithmic change down the pike. And so I think that's why I agree to do these podcasts, why you are doing these, is because you're trying to put out something of a positive nature in an environment that, while it doesn't necessarily reward that, is accessible to everyone, right? So someone who wants to hear it can hear it, and they can hear it for free, well, with their internet fee. But, it's the fact that it's not getting the most clicks, I mean, that should tell you actually that's a good thing. So, I mean, in an ironic kind of way.
Well, thanks for that. I feel better about showing up for the good fight each day now.
But I agree with you. That's what I thought too.
Back to the show. We're back from a break. We're here with Pam Rutledge, media psychologist and expert in the field. Pam, I have this question that I've been thinking about a long time. Are we now almost living in a fractured reality where different media ecosystems, whether it's Fox or CNN or the online worlds built around them, aren't just shaping opinion, but they're constructing entirely different versions of the world around us?
Yeah, I think that's true to some degree, that if we aren't willing to recognize the bubble that we're in, if we aren't willing to look for challenging voices, then we are in danger of creating one of these filter bubbles, one of these realities where our view is not going to mix with the view of the person next to us. And, it's obviously causes conflict politically, but I would also encourage people to recognize how that mindset of, my way or the highway, of this is my reality, is also a very difficult in relationships. In other words, if you have that the habit of thinking that, your reality is the only way or your perspective is the only way, it translates to all of the aspects of your life. So it's really important to evaluate, if you're willing to accept other people's reality, even in a partnership or even in a caregiver situation, or from a boss to an employee, that everyone has their own perspective. And so it's by understanding that point of view that allows you to have an actual relationship, to meet a common ground. Now, maybe you don't want to have a relationship with some of these people, but for the most part, having that a point of view where you're saying, well, isn't that interesting? That's not how I see the world. So tell me how you see the world, can be very helpful in breaking down barriers, husband and wife, partners, mothers and children. I mean, we see it a lot where the technology changes so fast that there's a big difference between the parent generation and the child generation. And that was a very interesting thing to me about all the initial video game research, is that nobody asked the kids what it meant to them. Everyone was just absolutely certain that, certain types of video games or certain types of content was doing something to the kids' point of view. But nobody asked the kids in it. And it reminded me of a time when I was early in my career, and I was doing clinical work, and I was working at an eating disorders clinic, and everybody was on the rampage about Barbie at the time. Poor Barbie. Anyway, so I have middle schoolers, and I'm like to my daughter, it's like, do dolls like Barbie ever bother you? Do they make you think you're less than, right? And my daughter looked at me like I was out of my mind. She goes, "Mom, it's a doll." Right? It's like, why is it that you think somebody who has, feet that, smaller than her hands, why that's going to influence my body image? And I thought that was so revealing. I mean, I know that's not true of all kids, but asking kids what these things have meaning, what have meaning it has for them is really important. So asking people, what is their reality? What do they see as the reason things are happening, or their truth, or however you want to say that, is a really important step in building, closeness and intimacy. And, I don't mean sexual. I just mean, being able to share, in a meaningful way. So I think that's the real downside of all of these realities, is losing that habit of listening.
We hear so much these days about the crisis of isolation and the crisis of loneliness, and that could mean your strict isolation from your neighbor who's got a different opinion for you, or the person who lives 2 doors down. And what a shame that is if you can't actually speak and understand and find the middle ground, or at least explore it together. What happens to society when politics stops being just a set of beliefs, but really starts functioning as identity, tribe, and almost of religious proportions?
Boy, I know there's going to be some historical evidence that shows that we can make it through this. And as my husband always says, it's a big country and it takes a lot of killing. But I think that it's very detrimental to the way we approach each other and the way we make choices, because we don't think about, well, if we don't like this, then where's a common ground, right? In other words, we seem to have lost the middle. Now, what I hope is that people become disenchanted with the extremes enough to find the middle, the silent majority. I mean, there's an awful lot of people out there who aren't making noise, who aren't particularly happy, right? On both sides. So what I hope is that shows up someplace else, and preferably in the voting booth. It doesn't need to be on social media, and I think the question is, and this speaks to something brought up earlier. The question is, how do you balance what you're hearing on social media with a somewhat of more reasonable voice? How do you bring, help, social, validation to people who are doing what your caretakers are doing? How do you acknowledge that you see the challenges that they face when it's not sexy or, antagonistic or any of those things? But you do, right? You keep bringing that out. And I think that's one of the reasons that podcasts have become so popular, is that people are a little bit fatigued by instant information. And, it's a little bit different if you're a teenager, right? Because your whole developmental task as a teenager is trying to figure out how to navigate your social world. So having lots of pictures of lots of people doing things is kind of, helpful, right? Because you're like, oh, more of this, more of that. I should wear that hat.
Yep.
And, yeah. So you're operating at a completely different level. But I'm encouraged to see people listening to podcasts. I hear it more and more. People, I listen to podcasts, or, that they're listening to people discuss things. Now, sometimes it's, celebrity things, and sometimes it's useful and valuable things like you all are doing. But people are taking the time to sit with a conversation. And, it's sort of the new talk radio, right? I mean, it's allowing people to take an idea and develop it. And no matter how frivolous that idea is, in some cases, the fact that you're with it and developing it is a good cognitive exercise.
I mean, maybe we just need to reinvent the echo chambers, because certainly, one question always comes to mind is like, how do the media echo chambers actually deepen the process of identification and that tribalism almost by just constantly reinforcing what people already believe and rewarding them for staying in that space.
Well, they have, these echo chambers have the advantage, which is that people are innately driven to feel like they're part of something, right? They want to have social connection. I mean, if you go back to some of the theories like self-determination theory, people, that's one of those core needs, being connected, feeling like you're agentic, like you have choice. And so you go into these groups that reaffirm your sense of self. And if, in fact, society is feeling disconnected, and we know that, there's less community engagement and all of those kinds of things, and if people are feeling disconnected, then those kinds of environments supply a genuine need. And so the question is, how do you supply that need and still allow people to not have such a narrow worldview? And I think that's a hard one.
I mean, what has to happen psychologically for someone to break out of an ideological echo chamber when changing their mind no longer feels like updating a belief, but rather, risking their identity, relationships, and sense of belonging?
Yeah, I think that, this is one of those things where I think if people had, we have all these regulations about, banning this and banning that and keeping kids from here. None of these regulations or legislative efforts, fund digital literacy in the schools. None of them, right? But if you know that there are these problems, then when it happens, you can see it. It's sort of like pre-bunking, that whole theory about if you give people some misinformation so they recognize it, then they're less likely to believe it. So if you give people the tools of critical thinking and you say, well, who is this benefiting? Who sent me this message? What's going on here? Then you're going to have less of that. It's much more difficult once you get people into a tribe. It's a little bit like a cult, right? There's a payoff to them in terms of how they feel about themselves and their acceptance in the group. And groups are vicious in reinforcing membership because if somebody leaves, then they have to question their own membership. So it isn't just about me being there. It's like, I need you to be in it too, because you being in it makes me feel like I'm doing the right thing.
So how does that constant reinforcement then and exposure to whether it's partisan media or certain beliefs, and compound that with the algorithmic reinforcement, how does that reshape how people see and relate to those who actually disagree with them, including maybe even friends, family, or the person they're caring for? I mean, you can see where there's a big backlash potential.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's a real problem with these tribes is that we hear all the time about people who, they won't visit their family anymore because their family doesn't vote the way they do, and so this is one of those cases where if you're talking with someone, you have to say, well, what are you losing by taking this position? Right? People are very loss averse, right? We know that from, all the work by Kahneman, Tversky, and all those people that people don't like to think about loss. And so what is this costing them to take this stand? And is it worth it? And how could you get back to the middle ground? But, it's not one of those things that's going to magically happen. I mean, I think that somebody is sort of like alcoholism. Somebody has to want to change before they actually change. And if they're getting payoffs from being part of the group, then the only thing that will change that is having that group fall out of favor, and they have to look for a new way of being. And so it will be very interesting to see if these political swings result in more conflict or with people scurrying about looking for new tribes.
Well, imagine if the algorithms actually somehow figured out how to keep that sense of loss aversion subdued, and that there was some way of just having the churn keep that fleeting moment of loss, a sense of loss, just subdued so that there's no aversion at all that ever creeps into the decision process or the engagement process. That would be wild if it's programmed to that level of granularity.
Well, it's it's programmed to the level where it will try and keep you engaged no matter what, right? Which is why when we've, very first started talking about doom scrolling, why you have to make some intentional decisions and boundaries about how you're going to use media, right? So all of these things we're talking about are sort of society level things. But if you're an individual and you're sort of awash in your social media, and and it's very understandable that someone who, is doing a very difficult job might want to escape into, some other thing, like whether it's Instagram or TikTok or whatever, um, in the evening to relax is to recognize how much you're doing it and to keep track of how it makes you feel. And people can do this just over a few days. Is just jot down, I did this and then I felt that. So that they understand their own patterns. Because, like I said, not all of it's bad. Some of it, watching funny cat videos is very healthy, right? It changes your body chemistry, it makes you smile. But listening to somebody rant on about, somebody that they think did something wrong or something political just ends up making you more anxious, more outraged, and less agentic. It makes you feel like you're a victim because there's nothing you can do about it, right? Not sitting there watching TikTok, for heaven's sakes, right? But so you end up feeling worse. So recognizing those patterns and then saying, okay, I'm going to use, Instagram for 15 minutes and I'm set my alarm. So after 15 minutes, I know that's when, it's sort of enough. And what I tell people about doom scrolling is pay attention to the point where the information is repeating. You're not getting more information. You have enough to understand whatever is out there that's understandable. Your goal is comprehension, not volume.
Mm-hmm.
And at the point when something comes by again, you're like, okay, it's kind of like doing a literature review. At the point when you start seeing the same articles over and over, it's like, okay, I'm done, right? That you aren't getting more information. And so what you're risking now is your peace of mind and say, okay, now it's time to stop. So you make these, before you start using any media, you make rules. I'm going to watch 2 episodes. I'm going to do that for 15 minutes. I'm going to something, right? And if I find myself in one of these negative news wormholes, I'm going to intentionally look for something happy right after that. I'm going to go listen to goats scream like people, or I'm going to, I'm going to do
something that makes you giggle,
something that makes you laugh, so that you are offsetting the negative motion. Now, the trouble with being a caregiver, I mean, among many, I'm sure, and don't mean to diminish this, but is that your job is to look for trouble. Right? So doom scrolling is a natural response to that instinct of making sure you can control everything and everything's going to be okay. But in fact, you can't control the news. And it will make you feel worse, not better, if you aren't just staying caught up, but you're sort of deep diving into the worst of it and, and letting your emotions, sort of play to your emotions rather than to your understanding of what's happening in the world.
So, Pam, how does this new media reality then begin to actually erode our ability to care for each other, to give to each other inside our own families even?
Well, it doesn't have to.
Good.
But like all things, it means that you have to make choices. And the media has what came so quickly and relatively speaking, so compelling compared to anything else that we'd experienced, that people were in the deep end of the pool before they even knew it was time to swim. So it means actually making intentional choices about how you want to live your day. And using whatever structural tricks, the same way we trick ourselves into getting up in time to go to work, we set the alarm, right? Because we really can't count on waking up automatically all by ourselves, right? So we have a structural support for doing something that we need to do or that we want to do, right? But it's the same way with if media is taking us someplace where we feel like we are not in the driver's seat, then you say, well, what structural supports can I have that will allow me to reclaim my control over my, over my life or my car or my hour or my day. And some of that is, okay, I'm going to, instead of picking up my phone automatically at the end of the day, I'm first going to have a cup of tea and sit for a minute, right? So you create rituals associated with habitual behaviors. Or you say, okay, I'm going to decide that my, bed is a tech-free zone. Now, I realize that's hard for those of us who also use our phone as our alarm clock, but, figure it out, right? Get alarm clock, right? But to establish boundaries that support the kind of behavior that you want to have, because most people do not feel good about themselves when they realize they just wasted an hour on Facebook.
Hey, you feel horrible.
Right? But it's entirely preventable if you recognize that once you get into Facebook, you have a hard time remembering to log off, so you set an alarm. The same way you would to get up or end a nap or
And it's
turn
not a
off the
sign you're
TV.
weak, it's a sign you're strategic.
Yeah, and that's what I want people to know. This isn't your fault, right? This is how our brain is wired, right? So you have to make choices based upon your own vulnerabilities so that so you're in charge, so that you can take advantage of those innate responses, not, meta.
So, what happens inside a family when an older adult spends 6 or 8 hours a day inside a media stream that just keeps reinforcing fear and grievance and ideological certainty?
Well, a couple things happen. The first is that in a family, the children will observe the parents' behaviors, right, in terms of media use. So the best way to get kids to use media responsibly is to use media responsibly yourself. So there's sort of that element that's the sort of behavioral. The other is that the act of being on media for that much removes you from the group. In other words, you might be sitting there in your chair, but your brain is elsewhere, right? So there's distance. So you've now created distance between the relationships. And if your point of view is different from the people in your family, you've created another kind of difference, because now there's all kinds of things you can't talk about. It's like my sister says at Thanksgiving, no politics. Which is funny because we pretty much all agree, but she still has that rule. But you also now are intractable, which means that any question a child or another adult wants to ask you, they're not going to ask you because you're not listening, you're telling. And, if there's any rule in parenting, it's listen first, right? And then, hold the lecture, right? No teenager wants to hear a lecture. Right? So it's very damaging. And
Guilty as charged.
What? Listening, lecturing before listening?
Yep, it's a skill.
It is. But I find, with all this media, that the kids' experience is so much different that if, and some things that just seem to us crazy, it's like, well, explain to me why you follow that influencer. What is it that you like about them? And it's very likely going to be something that you didn't notice.
Or maybe a different value system, which we're not attuned to.
But just, completely different. I used to joke that, I would show a picture of a living room to my husband. I would say, isn't that a pretty room? And he'd say, I don't like that couch. And I was like, no, I meant the colors. Right? So we see different things. And so it's anytime that someone else likes something, it's worth taking the time to say, why does that matter to you? What's the value there? And help me see it. And then once they tell you it, then you can say, well, what worries me about those things? Because you're owning that. You're not saying, well, that's really stupid. Don't you see that something? You're saying, what worries me is XYZ. Does that worry you? And it's remarkable. I don't think we give kids enough credit for being thoughtful about this stuff, because they're very insightful about a lot of this. especially once they've been made aware of how it works.
These relational interactions are so important, and not just in partnerships, but in families. Yet I think that's something that's being tuned away from engagement. I mean, I'd love to know what you think about this, but like, has the media just become an arms dealer for an endless ideological war, almost like supplying both sides with outrage, gotcha lines, moral ammunition? Because conflict is what's keeping us engaged, not reasonable discussions, relational commentary, respectful questioning and disagreement.
Well, that's certainly an element of what's going on. But but some people go online to see what people are wearing, or how to learn to knit, or how to churn butter, or how to repair their carburetor. So there are all other kinds of other ways that social media and internet access provides opportunities to connect with other people, or to learn about things, or we wouldn't have met if it weren't for the internet. So I think it's important not to forget the upside, and to recognize that we want the tyranny of the minority, right? That all of these loud voices are not the whole. And the only way to battle is to say, I'm going to keep doing the good stuff.
Funny story. My mom, who's 86, just moved from her house of 50 years into a condo in a senior's residence, and the weather this year in Montreal has been pretty rough, and she didn't make it out for a couple of weeks. And when I got there recently, I had car trouble, so I ended up Ubering to her place from about 50 miles out. And there we were, just ourselves for the weekend. And she said, I have no food. I have barely anything in the fridge. And I looked in the fridge, and then this recipe I saw on TikTok came to mind. And I made dinner for Mom. And so to that, a funny story, just to sort of capture the fact that if you self-curate a little bit, there is a valuable place for it. And little things can be learned.
Little things can be learned. And, with when my dad was in a retirement community, he used Facebook to keep up with what all the grandkids were doing, because they were at college hither and yon. And so when the family got together at the holidays, it wasn't like, well, what have you been up to, son? It was like, I really enjoyed your choral performance, right?
Wow.
He was able to sort of see and the kids used Facebook just so Grandpa would know what was going on. But it was the glue in between these relationships that mattered to these people, but they didn't have other ways of regular contact, because, pretty much no 19-year-old is going to spend a lot of time on the phone with their 90-year-old grandfather. So it was really important as a means of providing that kind of emotional glue.
That's wonderful. We've all become so much more alert to the risks of social media, and you've alluded to children earlier, but are we all equally vulnerable to sort of the capturing effects of media, or do older adults even face other risks just because they're so used to the world having started with there only being 3 TV channels, and now all of a sudden they're faced with endless short-form content being bombarded from every direction?
Well, so the first question, are we all equally vulnerable? Yes, we are all equally vulnerable. People who are in positions like caregivers, who are in stressful positions, and this is first responders, all of these kinds of people where they're on high alert a lot of the time, are going to be more reactive to the negative emotions. And so that's where it's important to sort of, take some self-care. And there's all kinds of self-care. One is taking a hot bath, and another is turning off your phone. So, it's sort of recognizing that. I've lost my train of thought. Ask me the question again. I'm sorry.
Well, just alluding to how maybe even older adults who are used to having 3 channels of media input now are suddenly just bombarded from every direction. And are they themselves vulnerable, and not just kids?
Yeah, right. And I'm sorry, I know where I was going with that, and it just went off. One of the difficult things about being old, right, is
Mhm.
that we're used to the world in a certain way. And so there's this presumption that something on the media has some kind of validation, right? Because initially, if you made it onto ABC, NBC, or whatever, you must have been important, right? Because you made it through this tremendous gauntlet of, and, whether or not, that meant you were sensible is an entirely different question. But there was a level of authority conferred on appearing in the media. And so anyone can be, of course, online these days, but it's very difficult if you have that mental model of being on the media confers authority to remember that it doesn't. And so someone appearing who looks sensible, especially if they were like wearing a doctor coat or something, right? It's can be additionally believable if you're holding that mental model. The other thing that makes older adults vulnerable is that they are at a period of life where they are, in fact, more vulnerable in all kinds of ways, right? Which means they are more sensitive to fear. So they're going to be much more vulnerable to scams, right? Maybe they don't quite understand how the computer works, or maybe they just are worried that, they're going to lose their Social Security, but they are much more vulnerable to information coming in, whether it's on the phone or the computer, and not checking. So, is that the fault of the media? No, but it gives bad actors a lot more access. They were always there, but now they just, have a bigger Rolodex, as if that were still a thing.
It sounds to me like the answer is not withdrawal, but really understanding how the system works, how we can ration our attention, ration our choices, protect our own attention span. As you say, setting limits that let us function, caregive, do a whole lot of things without being totally consumed. So, what do people really need to know to understand how media and platforms work if they want to stop being manipulated by the very platforms and systems they rely on to understand the world? Like, what are some of the key tools that we should carry in our back pocket just to sort of keep ourselves framed in the right context?
Well, the first is remember that you are in charge of you. You have the remote, you have the phone, you have the off button. So, it's sort of like just because the phone rings doesn't mean you have to answer it. And so you can make choices. And all of those choices are part of how you establish personal boundaries. There are all kinds of ways to turn off your notifications, silence your phone, make tech-free periods of the day. All of these tools are available once you decide what it is you want to do. So really the first thing is to decide what it is you want to do. And the second is to then figure out how what you're doing affects you. And then once you know those two things, then you can make adjustments. But maybe the third thing is to recognize that this is not a willpower thing. This is not, a deficiency of moral values that you're suckering into Instagram, right? This is a natural instinct, the way our brains are worked and the way these platforms are structured to get our attention. That we have completely different goals, right? Our goal is entertainment or information or social connection. Their goal is they're running a business and they need to make money and they're making money off of your attention, right? Expecting them to have our best interests is a fool's game, right? The only way we can protect our interests is to do it ourselves. So recognizing that you have the power and then remembering to give yourself compassion and grace about, if you are on longer than you meant, it's like, okay, so next time, tomorrow I'll set an alarm. Learn from these things. Anytime that there's something that goes on, and I think this is true for caregivers in general, learning how to reframe these thoughts that you have, because we all beat ourselves up. Recognizing
that inner
it
critic goes wild.
Yeah. So recognizing the voice of the inner critic, questioning it, and then reframing it, right? You aren't being lazy because you sat down for a minute to watch Instagram. You need a break. Self-care is important. You can't do your job without self-care, right? You got suckered into Instagram. That doesn't mean you're weak. It means that you were tired and you had less resistance to the way the algorithms are built. So when set some structural things like an alarm or whatever to provide you with the structure that you need. But it's really sort of taking charge and giving yourself some grace and compassion in terms of the whole thing and being willing to say, this isn't what I want and I need to make changes.
Speaking as, or if we take the position of someone who cares deeply about the world, politics, culture, how can you care about those things without letting the media and the algorithms pull you into, again, those tribal identity buckets? Like that's next layer, right? Compared to what you just told us about. How do we prevent that from happening?
Well, it is and it isn't, right? In other words, if you really care about those things, then you're following the news, right? But you're following the news and you're reading different voices. And at the point when you're not getting more information, you stop. Right? Because what you're doing is you're trying to be a responsible citizen. You're trying to understand what's going on from different points of view so that you can make your own opinion, right? If you care about culture, then actually the internet is a tremendous boon. You can tour all kinds of museums around the world in virtual reality on your computer. You can have access to all kinds of things, from musical concerts to, literature to discussion groups. All of these things are there if you want them. So there are ways of staying engaged. There are also ways of finding community groups that care about those same things, where you can meet, with real people in person, and connect. So I think let's not, throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
Let's recognize all the benefits that we can get. Did it turn out quite like we hoped, freeing, bringing us closer to democracy and every man has a voice and all that stuff? No, it didn't quite work out that way. But, there are also bad actors in the world who take advantage of these kinds of systems. And the only way to protect yourself from that is to develop awareness and intention and be very clear about what you want and think about what you're doing is getting you there.
So for caregivers especially listening, what are the true real signs that you would look for to acknowledge that your media diet's actually informing you rather than inflaming you?
Well, I think I like to say, evaluate your media use for a few days and see and monitor your mood. Now sometimes things happen in the world that are just genuinely depressing, right? There's a hurricane and people die. I mean, things happen, right? So it's not like you're supposed to be happy every day that you read the news, but where you are getting enough so that you feel informed, but you have the ability to step away. And it's that sort of ability to step away, that's enough. I don't need to read anything more about, Prince Harry. It's like where you haven't gone down a rabbit hole of pointlessness. And then to remember that along with the news, there are really fun things out there. So start to look for things that are delightful, that, make you happy. And then also take a few minutes every day to go outside. Physical touch of the environment offsets cortisol. And so if especially as a caregiver where you're in a stressful situation, having a few minutes to stand outside, breathe fresh air is a real reset for your body. Whether or not you're dealing with the media or just a really tough day, and then recognize that you can do meaningful work even when it's hard and not fun, right? That the not fun does not negate the meaning and purpose of what you're doing. These are the unsung heroes, and it's very hard for people looking in from the outside to understand the weight of the emotional labor that goes on in caregiving.
I like how you allude to the fact that meaning shouldn't be so erodible by just a little bit of bad news or a little bit of tension, or that the meaning can still stay intact and we're maybe more resilient than we think.
Well, yeah, and the ability to counteract your negative emotions with positive actually builds resilience. So it gets easier over time. So you're not, if you practice not beating yourself up by reframing things, pretty soon you won't be beating yourself up as much anymore, or you'll automatically start reframing that. So it's an important practice. And the other thing that I would say to people, all people actually, is every day spend a couple minutes thinking of 3 things you're grateful for. That has empirically been proven to improve your mood, your resilience, and your sort of general optimism. So it's especially difficult when somebody's in a hard job and they're in a period of struggle with whoever they're caring for. But if you can find 3 things to be grateful for, and it can be just a cup of hot coffee, but take a moment to be grateful, will actually over time transform your whole point of view.
I couldn't think of a more befitting way to end our discussion today, but with that thought that you're leaving us with. I really wanted to thank you today for breaking things down into a language that our listeners can understand and that restores some agency. We hear that word a lot these days, but it helps us feel like we have a little bit more control over our direction and our destiny.
Well, you're most welcome. I think that's the one thing people remember is that any act that builds your agency, sort of builds the whole pyramid. I mean, that's a really key.
That wraps up this week's episode of the Caregivers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark. Thanks for being here. Leave us a comment, leave us a review, share an idea. We look forward to hearing from you. Pam, what feels so important about this conversation is that it reminds us that attention is not a small thing. Attention is where we live. It shapes how we think, it shapes how we feel, how we respond to each other. And for caregivers especially, it shapes the quality of presence we're able to bring to the lives of the people who depend on us. If our attention is constantly being pulled into outrage, fear, and division, there's less of us left for discernment, steadiness, compassion, and care. So I hope one of the takeaways from today is that protecting your mind is not withdrawal. It's not indifference. It may actually be one of the most responsible and caring things a person can do. Pamela Rutledge, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind you of something important. The conversations you hear on this podcast are here to inform, to support, to spark reflection. They're not a substitute for professional medical advice, care, therapy, or crisis services. Listening to this podcast does not create a doctor-patient or caregiver-client relationship between us. If you're facing a medical concern, health challenge, a mental health challenge, or a caregiving situation that needs guidance, I encourage you to reach out to a qualified professional who knows your story. If you're ever in crisis, please don't wait. Call your local emergency number or recognize crisis hotline right away. You deserve real-time help and support. The views you hear on this show, whether from me or my guests, are our own. They don't necessarily reflect any organizations we work with, or are part of, or have worked with, or been part of in the past. This podcast is an independent production and it's not tied to any hospital, university, or healthcare system. Thank you for being here, for listening, and most of all, for taking the time to care for yourself while you continue to care for others. I look forward to hearing from you.